Session 6, Models for Inclusion of Same-Sex Marriage in the Marriage Canon. So in this session, we're going to talk about this document, This Holy Estate. What is this Holy Estate? A lot of the ideas that we already talked about in sessions 4 and 5 come from this Holy Estate. So basically, in 2013, the General Synod passed a resolution which called for the drafting of a motion to change the marriage canon to allow for the marriage of same-sex couples. The motion would be voted on at the General Synod of 2016. To that end, the Council of General Synod established a commission on the marriage canon to prepare a document which would demonstrate how such a change in the marriage canon could be understood to be scripturally and theologically coherent. In other words, what they wanted was a document which would show theological, scriptural support for same-sex marriage, not just the caricature that we talked about previously, that any support for same-sex marriage has to come from caving into secular culture, that it can't be biblically based. What they were looking for was basically a sound, coherent, theological, biblically based argument to support same-sex marriage. And the document was produced to this end, was basically This Holy Estate. So that was published in September of 2015. The document seeks a middle ground between the extremes of the two caricatured positions. Now these two caricatured positions, as I mentioned, we did discuss this in session 4 of this series, so let's just remember what those two positions are again. The choice between the Bible and caving into secular cultural pressure on the one hand. The other extreme is the choice is between outdated and oppressive biblical ideas and contemporary secular ideas of justice and equality. So we talked about that in session 4. We broke those two caricatures down in session 4. The document seeks this middle ground, which we talked about primarily in session 5. The document seeks this middle ground by considering what support for the changing of the marriage canon can be found in Scripture itself, as discussed in session 5 of this series. The document concludes by considering 3 possible models for a change in the marriage canon so as to include same-sex marriages. So we discussed previously what the theological support for it was. Now, what model should we consider? So these are the 3 models from This Holy Estate. The first model is the undifferentiated covenant model. So there's basic idea that, we have to understand marriage as a covenant, whether it's going to be a heterosexual marriage or a same-sex marriage. So this model basically says that all covenants are the same. It's an undifferentiated covenant model making use of gender-neutral language. So any reference to man and woman would be taken out of it, and it would just be the 2 parties involved in the marriage. Now there's strengths and weaknesses to this model. The strength is that, well, it's simple, it's straightforward, it's very clearly committed to equality, but there's some weaknesses to it as well. So it removes some of the symbolic richness from heterosexual marriage. So there's certainly the idea that there is some symbolic richness to heterosexual marriage based in the created anthropology, which we talked about before. Because even if sexuality is not understood as a primary principle, it is still there in Scripture. Scripture does say we are created as male and female, man and woman, and that there is some concept of complementarity there, even if it's not going to be elevated to an absolute or a primary principle. So there's definitely symbolic richness which is going to be lost from heterosexual marriage if you use an undifferentiated covenant model. But also it removes some richness from same-sex marriage as well. Same-sex marriage has its own kind of symbolism, and that's going to be lost too. In removing richness from both kinds, this is important, in removing richness from both kinds, it leans towards making marriage abstract. And as soon as it becomes more abstract like that, it tends to lack the depth which is required for a true covenant relationship. A covenant relationship is not an idea without flesh. It's deeply embodied, deeply concrete, and so that kind of deep embodied concrete depth is going to be lost if you make the language too abstract. The second model is not having church marriages at all, but basically having civil marriages, or the blessing, basically in the church, the blessing of same civil unions, or the blessing of same-sex civil marriages. Strength: it does not deprive traditional marriage of its symbolic richness. But the main weakness is that it deprives same-sex marriage of covenantal status, because neither civil marriages nor blessing of same-sex unions contain covenantal vows. And that is, really a great loss, because the core import is going to be that this has to be understood to be a covenantal relationship. Third model is the differentiated covenant model, the grafting in model. So basically, it's after the it's understood to be analogous to the grafting in of the Gentiles into the covenant with Israel, right? So it's going to be the marriage covenant and the graft of same-sex marriage as a covenant into the heterosexual covenant. So this would basically make use of differentiated language. There would be two marriage services, one for same-sex marriage and one for heterosexual marriage. Strengths of that would be it preserves the symbolic richness of both forms. It actually ends up increasing the richness of traditional marriage by expanding its meaning, because it basically, and this is particularly true with regards to the new interpretations of the second purpose of marriage. Remember, we discussed in session 5 the purposes of marriage, the second of which was for the fruitfulness, the procreation, and nurture of children. And if you reinterpret that to mean any form of giving of life through service of any kind in the community to others, right, then it expands the richness of traditional marriage by including more into its meaning. And just in terms of sheer practical purposes, it postpones the decision regarding a more radical, undifferentiated form. So basically, we're not sure about going all the way to the undifferentiated form. We'll have the grafting in model, the differentiated model. So therefore, the original understanding of heterosexual marriage doesn't have to change at all. We just have this grafting in model, so we can make a decision about an undifferentiated form later on. The weakness of this model is that the grafting in analogy here is flawed. Same-sex marriage is not of salvific consequence in the same way as the grafting in of the Gentiles to the covenant with Israel is. The response, now these are all critiques that the document This Holy Estate deals with. Their response to this particular critique is this, and I think it's a very good response. The church does not need to discern that same-sex marriage is an event of equal importance to the inclusion of the Gentiles, but it does need to discern whether it is a consequent development of the same redemptive action of Christ. So here you have an example of ongoing interpretation of not only the creation theology, but here in this of the salvation theology. So how does the salvation theology work? Can same-sex couples become married and be in a covenant relationship with one another in the same way that Christ is in a covenant relationship with the church? So those three models again: the undifferentiated covenant model, blessing of same-sex civil unions, civil marriages, which is the only one of the three that is not a covenant model, or the differentiated covenant model, the grafting in model, making use of differentiated language. Those are the three. What did the General Synod decide upon in 2016? What was the first reading? This one. they basically promoted the undifferentiated covenant model, making use of gender-neutral language. So let's look at that gender-neutral language. What were actually the proposed changes that were voted on for the marriage canon? So, resolution of General Synod 2016. So, be it resolved that this General Synod, 1. Declare that Canon 21 on marriage in the Church applies to all persons who are duly qualified by civil law to enter into marriage. Make the following consequential amendments. So, in paragraph 2 of the preface, delete the words "of the union of man and woman" in. In paragraph 4 of the preface, substitute the words "the parties to the marriage" for "the husband and the wife." C, in section 16A of the regulation, substitute "the parties to the marriage" for "a man and a woman." So in other words, they're just basically replacing the general gender-specific language with gender-neutral language, creating a model of covenant with undifferentiated language. Again, same thing, substitute "the parties to the marriage" for husband and wife. Add the following to section 11 of the regulations. A minister may only solemnize a marriage between persons of the same sex if authorized by the diocesan bishop. So now this deals with the authority issues. Who is going to have the authority to say whether or not same-sex marriage should be allowed in a particular diocese or in a particular parish even? So it first has to be authorized by a bishop. Declare that this resolution shall come into effect on the first day after January, after being passed by General Synod at the second reading. Okay, what are the important things to note about this motion? It provides for an opt-in method of adoption, meaning that while the passing of the second reading of the motion makes it possible, each diocese will have their own processes to decide how they wish to proceed. No diocese will be required to marry same-sex couples. Most of the canon remain changed, so no clergy will be forced to marry a couple against their conscience, according to Canon 21. So it's not even the authority of the bishop. The authority of the bishop will opt in or not in each particular diocese. But even then, each individual clergy will have the opt-in option, which will either side with or go against their conscience. So the discretion of a minister to decline to solemnize any particular marriage shall not be abrogated by this canon. I mean, that's already the case in the case of heterosexual marriages. So what has happened since General Synod 2016? Some bishops immediately stated that they would go ahead with the process of inclusion of same-sex marriage. Some bishops stated that they would not wait. Some bishops stated that they would wait until 2019, until the second reading. Some bishops said that they would go ahead with it right away. And in some dioceses, some same-sex marriages have already occurred. But some bishops said that they would wait until the second reading in 2019. Some bishops objected to any change in the canon at all. Some bishops made commitments to engage in dialogue within their dioceses, and certainly within the Central Diocese, Bishop John has very strongly encouraged this kind of dialogue. The House of Bishops continues to struggle with questions of unity and relationship. So that's the situation. We hope that the dialogue will continue.